Welcome, everyone, to the Reimagine Mobility podcast series. I'm here with Michael Dunne. Michael, thanks for joining me. Michael has his own podcast, so I'm hopefully going to learn some things from him today, who's been doing a whole lot longer than I have or we have here at ADL. And Michael, you've been covering China for quite a while, have a tremendous experience there when it comes to the mobility space and the transformation that this country has done over the last several years, certainly, to where it is today. Maybe introduce yourself, a little bit of history first. What is it that you're doing? What is your company doing? And then let's jump in and kind of brainstorm together how we see mobility reimagined here.
Tremendous. Thank you, first off, for having me today. It's an honor. Yes, China has come, well, a long way is an understatement of the century. I mean, I remember early days in the 1980s going to China. There were no private cars. There were handfuls of black sedans that belonged to high-ranking government officials. The idea, and those cars that were produced were, in the early days, largely not Chinese. They were Jeeps in Beijing Jeep. There were Santanas built by Volkswagen in Shanghai and Peugeots down south in Guangzhou. And I remember meeting senior officials in the Chinese government, and I said, this is, say, around 1990, when are we going to see Chinese cars on the road? And they said, oh, yeah, probably 10 years from now. So they had a realistic assessment of just how hard it would be to build an auto industry. And yet here we are 30 years later, and China finds itself in a dominant position. This year, China is already the world's largest exporter of cars, more than 5 million this year, surpassing Japan, and going to over 100 countries. In fact, I think the only countries Chinese cars are not in so far are the United States and, gosh, I don't know, maybe Taiwan. Otherwise, they're just flooding markets globally, and they're a powerhouse. And in Europe, the United States, and Japan, companies are looking and saying, oh my goodness, how do we stop this juggernaut? How do we contend with this new Chinese powerhouse in automotive?
Yeah. Very good. Great introduction. So I want to jump right to it. We as a global supplier to all the OEMs in the world, obviously the Chinese OEMs as well. The one thing we're always hearing out from our local people is the tremendous transformation and tremendous advantages, and maybe one could even argue surpassing those of the European and the US when it comes to infotainment, right? So the cluster, the center stack, and just in-vehicle infotainment, in-vehicle electronics, in-vehicle screens, all of that stuff. Maybe give us a little bit with your own words how far they've come and why. Is it that the Europeans and the US customers don't care about it? Is it that's so much more important for the Chinese that they maybe care less what's under the hood that was always so important for the US? Give us a little picture on that, maybe.
Yeah, so you hit it exactly. I think it's the why. The why is that, China's auto industry and market took off so rapidly that there really never developed a deep car culture in the sense that we know it in the West. For example, performance, handling, braking, speed never became that essential to a Chinese customer. Instead, in the early days, they're interested in fuel economy. So you had people going slowly, not more quickly. The emphasis was on, how do I save money around owning this car? And then with the advent of the iPhone and our move into the digital world, Chinese people began to see cars as places in which, they're in the driver's seat in the past. I'm going to enjoy my digital experience inside this thing called a car that happens to be taking me from point A to point B. And so very quickly, Chinese automakers saw, oh, this is what's important to a Chinese car consumer, the digital experience. And this is different from what we know in the United States and Europe, where, yes, it's important, but it hasn't been central. And that difference has allowed Chinese automakers to essentially leapfrog us in their capabilities in delivering a great digital experience.
Do you feel what we're also, another thing that we're hearing oftentimes is that the Chinese customer is okay with a consistent stream of over-the-air updates versus what we're in Europe is like, oh my gosh, that means something is wrong, something's going to break, I can't have it. And the US is still a little bit unsure. We know Tesla does it quite often, but it seems for everybody else it's like a taboo thing. Is this another thing that the Chinese are just, well, who cares if they're upgrading my second most expensive capital asset that I own besides my house? Or is it just, well, this is what it is and it has to be that way?
That's a great way of putting it. They do seem, as consumers, a lot more comfortable with over-the-air updates and technology driving their cars. I compare it to, for example, coming back to the United States, where we, after so many years in Asia and making payments with our phones, people here still write checks. What the hell is a check? Are you going to write a check? No, that doesn't exist anymore in Asia. So it feels as though the Chinese have been later to the game with technology, but quicker to adopt the latest changes in technology. That's a big and important difference, and it gives them an edge today, both as a manufacturer, I know what our customer wants, and the customer being more receptive to change more quickly. No problem. Bring the over-air updates. In fact, I expect more frequently. If I don't get them, I might look elsewhere.
The recent news I read from your newsletter that I again read every time it comes out is talking about the Chinese running somewhat a little bit on a maybe a glass ceiling as it relates to growth. We've seen a lot of startups. I want to come to that next after this question, the startup scene. But the growth, a little bit of a ceiling, right? And that's why the Chinese are pushing heavily into Europe, and maybe soon again will heavily or very strongly knock on the U.S. market. Is that what you see as well, or do they just see an opportunity to really suffice even consumers in U.S. in Europe that say, no, I like what the Chinese are doing. I like the technology. I like the electronics and the digital cockpit type thing, much more focused, and the maybe more still performance focused that we certainly see out of the German OEMs coming out. But put a little color on that perspective.
Let me put into effect this sort of 80-20 rule with a twist on it. So I feel as though pretty confident we can say that what's driving Chinese to export it in record numbers is that the domestic market has gone soft. If we look at total demand for vehicles, new cars in China today, it's about at the same level as it was 5-6 years ago. Now, that might surprise a lot of people. Wait a second, I heard EVs are taking off. They are. EVs now account for 1/3 of new car sales in China, but at the same time, demand for ICE vehicles has fallen off a cliff. You only have to look at the experience of Volkswagen or GM, Hyundai or Ford. Their sales year on year, compared to 2017, this year will be down anywhere from 40 to 60%. This is dramatically, and not a well understood story, but the bottom line is, think of China's domestic market as being flat, the growth has gone away, profits are dwindling, and therefore Chinese manufacturers, and in fact some joint ventures operating in China, are saying, gosh, in order to survive, we got to push product out. So we see weird things happening, like, for example, SAIC GM is exporting, that's the joint venture between GM and their Chinese partner, exporting Chevys built in China to Mexico, so that China has now become the #1 supplier of vehicles to Mexico. China is also exporting record number of vehicles to places like Russia. So definitely the impetus of this surge in Chinese exports is the domestic situation. As my Chinese friends tell me these days, hey, Mike, there's no money to be made at home. We got to go out. So that's the 80%. Yeah, we got to get out of here. We got to breathe. We got to find new oxygen. Then the 20% is they're landing in these new markets. Let's take the UK, for example, where Chinese automakers sell more than 100,000 cars this year easily. And people are discovering, whoa, these are Chinese cars built in China. These are tremendous, high quality fit and finish. They have the technology, so there's a surprise to the upside at a very competitive price. So those two factors are sort of converging at the same time and put China in the driver's seat, because customers in Europe and UK love what they see. And the Chinese manufacturers, for their part, are relieved that they don't have, the only option is to stay home and drown in overcapacity. Oh, there are outlets. So those two factors are really driving what we're seeing today.
So before we go to the startups, maybe one question in between that just triggered my mind when you said that. on the quality side, right? Which I think a lot of people are surprised about. Not us, again, we're working with them as well, and we've seen the tremendous, again, transformation again. Michael, where do you see that coming from? Why suddenly this focus on the quality? Is it because we realize the whole market is stalling and we got to export where the demand on quality is higher? Is it the West, companies like an AVL that is a supplier to the Chinese have taught them these things and now they're self-sufficient, so to speak? Is it a government push? Because we know a lot of things there happen when the government says go left, they go left, go right, they go right. What do you see? Why suddenly this focus on quality, and why suddenly have they been able so fast to get there, essentially doing it themselves?
When we think about quality, let me just pause for a moment, because there is a risk that we can't define yet. And that risk is that Chinese exports have come out in such big numbers so rapidly that we really do not have data around long-term reliability of those cars in markets outside of China. We just don't have it. What we can say is, wow, the fit and finish is impressive. The technology is great. So a little bit of, let's be a little careful. Let's see how consumers after 2 or 3 years feel about these products. Do they have the same levels of quality as a Hyundai, for example? Time will tell. So that's a note of caution. But to your question, I think it is a combination. The government definitely is encouraging exports through subsidies, rebates, low-cost loans, lower energy costs. Let's move these products out in order to sustain employment. So that's happening. Also true, companies like AVL and so many hundreds of other Western companies have been ensconced in China for so long. My Chinese friends tell me, the reputation out there is that the Chinese have one way or another purloined or borrowed or, if you will, stolen IP knowledge from the West. He said it's actually much simpler. We're just sort of hanging around, listening, watching, taking notes. And after a couple decades, we get the processes down, and that's sort of come to fruition now in 2023. Third and final point is don't underestimate the value of design. Geely a few years ago, BYD, they started to heavily recruit. They looked at the experience of Hyundai and Kia. They started to heavily recruit very talented designers out of Europe, places like Mercedes and Audi and BMW, and said, for us to be world-class, we have to look great. And if we look at the designs of Chinese cars in the last 3 to 4 years, they've been transformational in terms of their beauty and their attractiveness. So they took cues from Korea, said in order to go to the next level, we need great design. And today there's several hundred Western designers working at Chinese companies today. So that's also been a big benefit to this Chinese march to globalization.
Okay, very interesting. So let's jump to the startup scene. I mean, the startup scene in the mobility space has been up until, again, 3, maybe 5 years ago, heavily dominated maybe by the U.S. market, right? We have a few now in Europe. Rimac comes right away to mind. But then we go to China, and there's just many of them. I'm not going to say a gazillion, but certainly a handful, if not 15 or so that I can think of. Why suddenly the growth in the mobility space to, instead of state-owned enterprises that was traditionally always there, why now suddenly just startups and why automotive?
So, forever the playbook for China was, we're going to invite global auto manufacturers and suppliers into our backyard, and we'll gradually learn the game from them. But at a certain point, this is right around 2014, when China launched this big policy called Made in China 2025, a vision of being leaders in next generation technologies. At that point in time, top government officials looked around and said, you know what, we've given our own auto manufacturers plenty of time to learn and compete, and they just have not been up to stuff. They have not delivered. So what can we do to infuse our industry with real innovation, with something that's breakthrough, that's entrepreneurial? And they didn't have to look far to discover, right in their backyard, there were these companies that had, the leaders of these companies that had become billionaires building great companies in the internet sector. So think of like Elon Musk equivalents, guys like William Li at NIO, and guys like Li Xiang at Li Auto, and of course He Xiaopeng at XPeng. These guys were already accomplished billionaires. They knew tech, and like Elon Musk, the government looked and said, hey, get these guys into the arena. Maybe they can make something happen. And that's exactly what we've seen since those three guys in particular have come into the auto industry. We can see an acceleration of appreciation for technology and innovation. And if they've, just like Tesla's sort of been a catalyst for awakening the West to next generation tech, including, as you mentioned earlier, things like over-the-air update, the same thing is happening here in China. So today, NIO, XPeng, and Li Auto are not the biggest in terms of volume. They're not even profitable, but they've had a big impact in terms of bringing the entire Chinese industry forward so it could be more globally competitive.
So they brought the challenger in, kind of challenging the status quo and made them just, I think, like the startups in the U.S. as well, right? Showed the traditional OEMs, no, you actually can move faster. It is possible and all that. So it's interesting.
That's right. That's right. And there will be, they may or may not make it, but they served a useful role. And with Tesla, it's helpful to remind ourselves, until 2019, 2020, Tesla was on the ropes. You know, there was building cars in tents and cash was tight and it could have gone down, but it didn't. So that's what we're looking at. Now, what also makes China an interesting case study is from the very beginning, the Chinese central government has wanted to have these 6 big state enterprises, known in China as the Big Six, lead everything. They're going to be the emblem of Chinese automotive for the world. But there's an issue with that. Actually, the private companies and these entrepreneurial companies move more quickly and innovate better. So there's a dilemma for leaders. Like, oh, we want Beijing Auto to be a world-class automaker, but they're just not there. What are we going to do? That's still to be resolved. We don't know yet how that's going to play out.
Interesting. So over the last few years, I've read more and more on how advanced, for example, BYD in e-mobility is, right? Their batteries are doing their own batteries now. Their vehicles are getting better and better. There's a tremendous amount of growth in vehicle volume. So when we'll take BYD out for a moment, what are some of the surprises in China that you have witnessed over the last three plus years, let's say? Again, you mentioned earlier that the Westerners or the Europeans may be on a steady decline, let's say, and certainly more and more challenged. I mean, we see that we work with the American OEMs, we work with the European OEMs, and many of those programs have to do with going to China, and we see the struggles year over year that they're facing with to make not necessarily inroads. I think they're there, but to increase sales again instead of just holding steady or slightly going down. What are some of the surprises outside of maybe, again, BYD that you have seen, and why do you believe that is?
I love that question because there is a tendency in the West to say Chinese automakers writ large, as if they're all the same, but in fact, they're quite different. And I would put BYD in a class by itself, way above everyone else. And in the electric sector, BYD accounts for almost half of production and sales in the country. So you've got this powerhouse called BYD. Then you have a lot of other aspirants, companies that aspire to be at the level of BYD. So a couple that are interesting in my mind are, one is Geely, which has taken the strategy of creating a large portfolio of brands, including, for example, Volvo, Polestar, Lotus, Proton, has a joint venture with Mercedes in which they make the smart car. And it seems like Geely's approach to Western markets is, let's acquire the brand with the legacy and the reputation and ride that. And up until now, that's worked extremely well. If you ask a typical American or European, where's Volvo from? If you ask 100 of them, 99 of them are going to say, well, yeah, Sweden. What about the Polestar? Oh, clearly that's a Swedish brand. But in fact, Polestars are manufactured in China, owned by a Chinese company. So one interesting twist or angle for coming out of China is the acquisition of Western brands. So they don't have to take decades to build up that recognition and that credibility. That's one. I think the second interesting play is that we've seen China become a manufacturing hub for the world. So what do I mean by that? Tesla, quietly, I just looking at the numbers yesterday, more than one of every 2 Teslas built in the world this year is built in China. 52% of Tesla's total global production is in China. Much of that goes for export. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, GM, Hyundai, Volkswagen, Renault are also exporting from China. So there's a risk for the world that, hey, we don't need to produce cars anywhere in the world except for China because they are low cost, they have the supply chains, they have the technology, they have the ambition, the government wants it that way. And that gets interesting in a hurry. And that's one of the reasons why just last week we saw in Europe, the European Commission is opening an investigation into subsidies by the Chinese government to propel these exports. So that's almost existential for Western automakers in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. How are we going to compete with this juggernaut? There's no easy answers outside of, for example, the short-term tariffs. So those are the 2 things I'm watching. One is Chinese acquiring brands to accelerate their expansion globally, and 2, China itself becoming a unstoppable car Godzilla, destroying everything in its way. Come on, who wants to try to compete with us? Nobody can. Next, who's up next? That's what we're looking at. And I think the United States a little bit is at risk because we don't see Chinese cars on our roads. We think China, far away. It's like the other side of Mars, so far away. Don't sleep on China. Don't be naive. They're coming. They're going to markets worldwide, and they will work very hard to come to the United States too. We should be prepared.
So if we go for a moment to technology and say, how do you reimagine mobility in 5 years, Michael? What do you see? Do you see autonomous vehicles that I know, for example, in China are even more prevalent and I think also pushed, I would say, than anywhere else in the world, and maybe also with significantly more government support than anywhere else, which I think helps in this case? Or is it more on the infotainment side? Is it, I don't know, whatever it might be, but 1 or 2 topics that you reimagine yourself seeing mobility look like in 5 years. What are they?
Right. So first off, I feel as though we're at a pivot point where 5 years from now, we're going to be looking at probably 3 distinctive market regions in the world. So if the last 25 to 30 years was defined by globalization and integration, my sense is that not total decoupling, but they're calling it de-risking, but a reset in the way that in which we approach our respective auto industries. So, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act has ignited more than $100 billion in investments here in the United States in batteries and battery supply chains. And when you talk to people in the industry, they say, going forward, look for 1 set of battery and battery supply chains in Europe, 1 in the U.S., 1 in Asia, maybe another, 2 in Asia, 1 in China, 1 in Japan, Korea. The point being that we're reversing the trend of globalization where let's just outsource everything to China and everyone will be happy. No, that era is probably over. So the first big change is technologically, we'll all have our technology kingdoms. Okay. Secondly, I think with regards to autonomy, you're absolutely right. China's government is totally aligned with accelerating autonomous commercialization, not just research, but putting it into action. So I expect that 5 years from now, China will enjoy a substantial lead over the West when it comes to autonomy. In no small part because, the regulators in China they're incentivized to make sure autonomous vehicles get commercialized. And regulators here in the United States, probably in Europe, are incentivized to say, we hope nothing goes wrong. And so we see incidents in San Francisco, right? In San Francisco, oh my goodness, you held up an ambulance. This is kingdom come, the disaster. We have to stop all autonomous testing, which I understand. If I'm a person on the street in San Francisco, I see a bunch of cruise vehicles stuck at an intersection. I'm not happy either, but it's a different world. It's a different planet. So China has a big edge when it comes to autonomy. And then your third point about the digital experience, I think that's very consumer specific. So it won't be one, just because China has an advantage in digital experience in China, that may or may not be relevant to how they connect with consumers outside of their home market. That'll also be market by market. That's my feeling. Yeah, three kingdoms. The Chinese always talk about Sanguo, the three kingdoms. I think we're moving into an era of three kingdoms, not one big happy kingdom.
Sounds good. Last question, Michael, before we wrap it up, and totally different than what we've talked about. What's going to be the next car you're buying and why?
It's going to be very likely I'm going to get the model. No, hang on. Let me restate that. Gosh, there's so many good cars going through my mind. I'm going for the Cybertruck. I'm just going to just throw it out. I've driven Tesla since 2015, and I've probably been lucky. I've had a phenomenal experience in every way. The driving, over-the-air updates, the charging experience. I know other people have not, some other people have not, but I've been very happy with my experience, and I intend my next car will be a Tesla.
With that, let's wrap it up. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. And again, a big fan of your podcast. And thank you so much for sharing your perspective on Reimagine Mobility, and certainly Reimagine Mobility with focus on China here. It's been great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I think the number one takeaway is that for the first time, China's not staying at home. For the last 20, 25 years, we've been able to go, yes, I'll go along with my business. China's far away. That's no longer true. They're on the move. And the best thing we can do is get ready for that, to be more competitive. Please do check out, a small commercial here, my newsletter and the podcast and our website, www.dunneinsights.com. You'll find out how we can help your companies contend with the competition coming out of China.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks for listening to Reimagine Mobility Podcast. If you like this episode, please subscribe and tell a friend.